is Saturday, June 27th, and welcome to another edition of the Armstrong-Williams Show. You know, the headlines may have changed, but the uncertainty has not. A ceasefire between Israel and Iran may have paused the fighting, but it has not answered the larger questions. Has the threat truly diminished, or has it merely been postponed? Has America restored deterrence, or are we witnessing only the end of one chapter and a much longer conflict? And at the same time, another concern is weighing heavily on the minds of millions, not overseas, but in their own neighborhoods. Around the world, fear of crime is reshaping how people live, where businesses invest, and whether families feel safe in their own communities. Even where crime statistics are improving, public confidence often is not. Today, we examine those two defining issues of our time: global security, public safety. Though they may seem different, they ask the same fundamental question: can a government protect the people while preserving the freedoms that define democratic societies? But before we get to that, let me introduce our guest, Robert HILLARD, PATILLO, civil rights attorney and radio host, and Andrew Donaldson, political commentator. First, I want to start with you, Andrew. What were your thoughts about the Supreme Court's ruling with the precedent on the citizens being born in the United States?
Well, I haven't had a chance to read through the entire thing yet, and I'm still waiting to see what they're going to come up with thing. But this is a very fundamental question in a lot of ways, and this is a question that unfortunately has gotten way into the ways of people's thoughts and feels and their priors and their prejudices and things like that, and gotten way far away from the law. Now, I think what the Supreme Court's going to do here is they're going to refocus it back to the law, and then we're going to have a hard time focusing people onto what the actual law is and what does it mean to be a citizen, who gets to be a citizen, who doesn't, and turning down the tenor of that argument. I doubt that happens. I think it's going to be a flashpoint, much like we saw with the Roe v. Wade decision. I think a lot of people are going to take it. There'll be a short pause, and then it'll come back even hotter and heavier right after that.
But you know, Robert, the issue is whether or not it was ever meant to be temporary and not permanent, and respecting the rule of law. That's what it boils down to.
That's what it boils down to. But it comes down to this question of interpretation and also to this question of precedence. One of the biggest issues that I have with the current Roberts Court is it seems to be very fast and loose with stare decisis, fast and loose with Supreme Court precedents, fast and loose with even their own internal statements and their own internal previous comments. And so when you don't have that consistency on the bench, we don't have that consistency in the judiciary, well, that means that everything becomes political. There was a point in time where many of us simply believed that the opinions of the Supreme Court were sacrosanct, but instead of that, now we have this system where you have both parties essentially just praying for the death of Supreme Court justices and playing a game of roulette, saying, well, if enough of them can die in time, then I can pat the court with who I want there, and then we can just flip all the rules and all the laws back across, on their heads. That is not how the system was intended to operate. And we have a system where there is no certainty, where there is no true basis of what American law is, and where we're truthfully going through a completely political process that our judiciary was never intended to be part of. So this is a very dangerous place for our democracy to be at currently, because when you have a Supreme Court that appears to simply be another political instrument and political body, that means there is no true natural law, as the Enlightenment thinkers would say. It simply means there's only this question of power, and whoever has power decides what is right and wrong, and that's a scary place for American democracy.
You know, Andrew, the U.S. Senate this week, from having backbone on the Iran War Act to trying to make up to the president after he met with the Senate, isn't Congress supposed to be a check and balance on presidential powers?
Yeah, and everything else, like our friend just pointed out correctly, part of the reason the court's such a mess right now, and if there's a theme of the Roberts Court, is Congress is supposed to deal with this. We shouldn't even be dealing with this. Congress should be. Congress has abrogated so much of its power to the executive, and the Supreme Court has increasingly, through litigation and our litigation-mad society, been the avenue people have tried, both sides, everybody involved, tried to litigate laws that way, because Congress has just abrogated their power to legislate or do anything outside of run for their own elections over and over again. And now this GOP Congress especially has pretty much given over all its power to the executive in the form of President Trump, everything's out of whack. So whether it's foreign policy, whether it's the economy, whether it's tax or education policy, or it's the Supreme Court itself, and even getting nominations through, everything's out of whack. And it starts with Congress. And Congress is our representation. It's the branch we have the most control over. But for some reason, we as a people don't want to control it and rein it in. And until we do, thus is thus.
You know, something just fell in my spirit. It was certainly not something I expected asked today, but it reminded me of the thousands of people in Venezuela that were hit by 2 earthquakes, and thousands have died, thousands are unaccounted for. And it reminds us, no matter how much power Congress have, no matter how many wars we fight, there are some things that man still has no control over, and it's so unknown to them that when it hits, it's so devastating, and sometimes it's just so hard to react. How should we react to these natural disasters, Robert? And how should we respond with our compassion and the fact, yet by the grace of God, so goes I, it could have been me, and show support and empathy in situations like this?
Armstrong, you're completely right. And as you know, my family's from Haiti, and we had our own devastating earthquake a decade ago that the island never truly recovered from. But this is a place where, as Americans, we just went in and took the president of Venezuela, asserting that we have hegemonic control. President Trump says, I will be in control of Venezuela going forward, which means this is now an American responsibility. We officially run the government of Venezuela, meaning that the conditions for the people there, meaning that the rescue and recovery for the people there, the evacuation for the thousands of people displaced, the hundreds of people killed, now ultimately fall on the backs of the American people. You break it, you bought it. You kidnap the president, now you have a responsibility. And when you have a government now that has essentially destroyed USAID, which has gutted many of our systems that will bring in refugees, people who have been affected by these natural disasters, who will be able to be temporarily resettled and then sent back home once the nation is stabilized. We do not have those apparatuses in place anymore. We have an asylum system where people are supposed to be able to claim asylum from natural disasters that is completely broken. So what we need is, and as my fellow panelists said, is we need a functioning Congress right now. We need a Speaker of the House who is not a lapdog to the President of the United States. The Speaker of the House is literally supposed to be the person who can go toe-to-toe with the President and tell him no. Same thing with the leader, majority leader in the Senate. Those are the people who have to assert that in order for America to have power within our hegemonic sphere of influence, we cannot simply lead with military power alone and drone strikes and blowing up boats. We also have to provide the type of humanitarian aid, the type of political assistance, the type of logistical assistance that only a first world nation like America can do. And we have a naval armada still stationed in the Caribbean, poised to invade Cuba. How about we divert a few of those ships away from the invasion of Cuba and go lend the assistance necessary to save the people of Venezuela, because they've gone through a lot because of much of what we've done.
Andrew, what lessons should the United States, Israel, and America, actually, and our regional allies take from the events of the past several weeks? And also, let's not forget that the UK will soon have its, 8th prime minister in the last 9 years? I mean, it's almost unprecedented.
Well, seventh, but we know who the 8th is going to be shortly after he has a whole trouble, because he's not going to be able to succeed with the structural problems they have.
Right.
Do you have about 3 hours? Because it's going to take a while to go through all the lessons we need to learn from this Iran mess.
Take 3 minutes.
Yes, sir. I'll do my best. The biggest things we need to learn is there's a couple things. One is, you just mentioned England. Normally, England can project military power and go with us to things. They were literally unable to do so in any meaningful thing. So those are things that we have to learn. Israel and America has a real problem right now, because they've got to figure out how to get back on the same page. There's a clear rift with both President Trump and J.D. Vance, the vice president, taking open shots at the cabinet and leadership of Israel. That's got to be settled. And of course, there's the fact that we have this MOU mess with Iran, where Iran is putting it onto Israel, whether they stop or not. Israel isn't party to the MOU at all. You have all these disjointed things. There's just a basic lack of competence and coherency to our foreign policy right now. And I think you're going to see the globe adjust. I think you're going to see the GCC countries start trying to figure out how to make the Strait of Hormuz less of a choke point. You're going to see more pipelines. You're going to see a relitigation of how logistics and transportation out of Gulf, not just oil that we always talk about, but fertilizer, which is getting ready to cause yet another famine in Africa that not enough people are talking about. I think you're going to see a readjustment of the world trying to figure out how to isolate Iran a little bit more and understand they can't just rely on the U.S. presence to do it every single time, especially with the current administration and leadership.
So Robert, on that point, what does victory actually look like in the Middle East today? Is it regime change, preventing a nuclear Iran, regional stability, or something else? And now it looks like Iran is trying to charge for ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, victory in the Middle East, it looks exactly how it looked 100 years ago, which is leaving those people the hell alone. You cannot win. Ask Alexander the Great. Ask all the great powers throughout history. You cannot win. You cannot govern this area. These are not a group of people that are simply going to be brought to heel under military intervention. You're not going to win the hearts and minds of the communities. You're going to have to treat them as adults and as neighbors. We've had sanctions on the Iranian regime for 50 years. It has not worked. We've bombed them twice in the last year. It has not worked. The Iraqis sent a ground invasion in the 80s and were there for 10 years. It did not work. So at some point in time, you have to stop trying to militarily conquer this region and just treat them as a center of power in the global community. The Middle East combined is an economic system larger than the EU, with more assets than the EU, with better universities at this point in time than the EU, with more innovation than the EU. So if we're talking about power centers going into the second half of the 21st century, you're going to have to look at the American-backed Western Alliance. You're going to have to look at the Far East patch with China, and then you're going to have to look at the Middle East as being a true power center going forward. Stop trying to conquer them, and that is how you will have victory. And at the end of the day, Israel is going to have to determine whether or not they're going to have a continuous militaristic city-state with attempts through bombings and assassinations to control its neighbors, or to normalize relationships with the people around. There was a time 50 years ago that having Israel sitting down at the table with Egypt or Jordan seemed insane, but it worked out over the course of time through diplomacy. The same can be done with these proxy groups through a diplomatic effort, but these continuous wars in the region are only working to soak away American blood, American treasure, and to make China stronger every single time we drop a bomb.
And we'll be back. Andrew, this past May, a key measure of inflation climbed as surging oil pushed costs higher. Is that a concern?
Always a concern. Inflation is something that has to be very, very carefully managed. You don't want it to go up fast. You don't want it to come back down fast. And folks that want it to come back down fast, I understand why they want that to happen, but that is also bad. This is very delicate stuff, especially with the volatility in the world economy right now. The biggest thing to worry about right now is that a lot of this volatility is self-induced. We need some coherent policy where we're stop doing economic things just on whims, and this is President Trump's fault and a lot of other folks' fault too. You got to quit doing economics on a short-sighted political circadian rhythm of politics. It's never going to work. It's always going to make the economy worse. Now, I understand that's how the world works, and we can't be Pollyannish about it, but things like oil, it goes up fast, it comes down slow. And if you try to tinker with that, it's going to make it worse. Same thing with inflation. If you try to arbitrarily move it around too much as the government, you're going to make it worse. And I know that's a really hard thing to say in a contentious election year. I don't think anybody's going to really listen to me about that, but that's the truth of it. And I know the president always gets too much blame and too much credit for the economy, but especially this president who wants to hang his hat on the economy all the time, he's going to be under tremendous pressure and putting pressure on everybody else to do something about consumer prices and inflation. But the only levers he has to pull is probably going to make it worse, not better.
So, Robert, what role should Congress play when presidents make rapid military decisions during an international crisis? Have we found the proper constitutional balance?
No, we're nowhere near the proper balance. The Constitution made the power to make war. They put it in the powers of Congress for a reason. The military venturism is why America is a country right now. If it wasn't for Great Britain simply deciding that the Queen was going to launch a bunch of ill-advised wars across the globe during the 7 Years' War and the Spanish-American, or the French and Indian War, as it was here in North America, the British would have run up so much debt that they had to start levying additional taxes against the U.S. colonies, which led to their military overextension and thus America being able to, of course, revolt and win the revolution, becoming a free nation. We should read history books occasionally. in this country and realize that we're falling into the exact same trap that we fell into before. Since Congress abdicated their ability, their constitutional right, their duty to make war, what have we seen? We've seen military ventures in Vietnam. We've seen military ventures throughout the Middle East. We've seen war after war after war, none of them making America stronger, none of them making America richer, none of them making America more powerful. We fight wars now for the defense industrial complex. We need to get rid of these bombs before they expire so we can order some new bombs before those expire. So we got to find somebody to drop them on. That what seems like is driving our war footing, as well as social media videos and whatever the latest far right-wing talking points may be at any given time. So we have to get back to a place where Congress says that we're going to sacrifice the lives. Remember, 13 individuals died in this war against Iran for no apparent reason that benefits the American people. And we're talking about sacrificing the lives of our service people. It needs to be a decision come to by the American people writ large, not by one individual and not by some small cadre of people who have ties to the defense industry. If you're going to put us into war, put some skin in the game. Let's go back to the days of our leaders leading our troops in on horseback or leading our troops in at the vanguard, not simply sending the poor among us off to die for corporate interests. I think if you start doing that again, you'll start seeing more coherent decisions coming out when it comes to our military ventures around the globe. If Barron was in this war, we wouldn't be making the same decisions we're making right now.
You know, Andrew, how have America's allies and its adversaries, such as China and Russia, interpreted the outcome of this conflict?
They're pretty much where they were before. Remember, they like to keep Iran right where they are in a lot of ways. They like to tease them with giving them just enough nuclear technology without them actually getting all the way there. You watch, a lot of this money is probably going to get routed through China for the infrastructure rebuild. That's something to keep an eye on. Russia, of course, has got its own problems in Ukraine right now, but China especially, they love to use infrastructure to expand their authority. So when you got something like Iran that's been kind of a proxy that they like to use to keep a thorn in the side of Western powers, especially America, especially the Middle East, you watch a lot of this infrastructure, that's kind of their bread and butter. They go into these countries, watch some of this money goes into them. They're always watching for opportunities like this because remember, they understand that their window of opportunity for global influence is also closing with their economic and demographic crisis that's going to be coming in the next 10, 15 years. If they see an opening here, they will take it.
You know, Robert, looking 5 years ahead, what poses the greatest threat to stability in the Middle East? Iran, nuclear ambitions, terrorism, proxy militias, regional rivalries, or American disengagement?
I think it's a combination of all of the above, because let's look at the historical precedents of when the European powers pulled out of the Middle East after World War II. It was or even dating back to that, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the loss of of a hegemon to control that region. What you saw was literally a half century of chaos as a result of that. You saw lines being arbitrarily drawn, not making any condition as to ethnic or linguistic or religious ties or historical nature. You saw governments being set up without asking for the consent of the people. You saw us propping up strongmen and then overthrowing those strongmen when they didn't agree with us, and then propping up new strongmen within the region. So if you have a complete, if America just pulls up all their bases tomorrow, gets their carriers and comes out of the region, you'll see a region-wide war within days of that taking place. That's just what is going to happen. Conversely, if you simply tell Israel they're on it at it alone, there will be no more constraints on what Netanyahu has. At least right now, President Biden or President Trump, they have to come to us in order to ask for the type of armaments they need or ask for permission or coordination in order to launch some of these military interventions. If you take that leash off of Netanyahu, particularly given his political situation and criminal situation in Israel right now, there's nothing to say that he wouldn't launch full-blown ground invasions and conquer all of Lebanon or even expand the Israeli lines down into the Sinai Peninsula as they've done previously. So we have to find a diplomatic solution to this that brings all parties to the table. We have to look at something as toxic as it is to the conservatives, like the JCPOA, which was an agreement that brought together Russia, the EU, China, the United States, Iran, the Gulf nations, and a 20-year program to prevent war. It is clear at this point in time that the diplomatic solution, we've had the military solution under George W. Bush, a diplomatic solution under Barack Obama, a military solution under Donald Trump. The diplomatic solution under Obama was the only one that had any chance of long-term peace and stability, and that's what we have to return to.
You know, An interesting ruling from the Supreme Court this week that's getting little attention is that the court struck down a law that restricted gun ownership on private property in Hawaii. I was struck by that, Andrew.
Yeah. Yeah, Alito had actually really good line that, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said the spirit of aloha does not trump the Second Amendment, which was kind of cute. And even somebody who kind of legendarily doesn't have a great sense of humor and get a line in once in a while. There's a lot going on with the Second Amendment that's just not getting attention right now. For example, Abigail Spanberger, she ran very moderately on the economy and things like that. And the very first thing she did on office was start a big fight over guns and the Second Amendment. The advocacy wings of the world are never going to give this up. It's a big driver of fundraiser. It's a passionate issue for a lot of people, but it's telling when somebody like the governor of Virginia, that's also telling you they don't think they're going to be challenged in that position or they wouldn't pick that fight right off the bat. You're going to keep seeing this worldwide. And when you see this go up to the Supreme Court over and over again, we don't have a good definition of the Second Amendment even after 250 years of debating it, which is kind of sad on a lot of levels, but it's also because we don't seem to want to get the nomenclature right. We don't want to differentiate between private weapons. We don't want to differentiate between crime. And here we go again, not to be a broken record, but a lot of this should have been dealt with by Congress. And Congress just has a cowardliness where they don't want to touch issues like this. And we keep litigating it through the courts. So whether the court is a conservative court or a liberal court or a moderate court, as we go down the road of this country, hopefully for another 250 years, it's going to keep oscillating back and forth if we, the people, don't, through our House of Congress, put some laws down so we're not just litigating this over and over again on what we really want to believe about the Second Amendment.
You know, Robert, obviously, the president has refused to sign the bipartisan housing bill. But the irony of this is that Congress doesn't need the president's signature.
You're correct, but this is the equivalent of blowing a layup in the fourth quarter of the Game 7. You're in a situation right now, if you're Republicans and you're the president, everything's gone bad this year. Nothing good has happened in 2026 for the Republican Party, starting with from the time you guys dropped off Maduro. From then on out, everything else has been bad. So House Republicans, one of the least productive Congresses in American history when it comes to passing laws. This has been one of the least productive Congresses. I mean, they literally pass maybe 1 or 2 laws per year. You're able to cobble together a bipartisan majority on the one issue facing Americans across the board, regardless of region, regardless of race, religion, anything else, which is the housing crisis, which is affecting this country. You have it across the finish line, and all the president has to do is show up, sign it, and smile. And you blow the layup in the fourth quarter over this silly political spat that the president cannot win. If you want to pass the SAVE Act, you don't campaign against Cassidy. If you want to pass the SAVE Act, you don't campaign against Cornyn. If you want to pass the SAVE Act, you don't piss off half of your own caucus in Congress, therefore for not having the votes to push it through. What is Murkowski going to do? What is Collins going to do on this? So when John Thune says we don't have the votes, you don't have the votes. Stop pushing the issue. But if we can change the subject to housing, affordability, saying the Republicans are delivering for the American people, we're focused on the real things that matter, while Democrats are worried about attacking Trump, that is something that at least you can have a sliver of light to sell in Texas, where Kim Paxton and all his impeachments and affairs are going to be running against Tallarico. Give him something to run on, and you blow the layup. I don't understand what this White House's plan is. This browbeating of Republicans is not getting him any closer to passing the act. That all you're doing is not just saying that more than likely the House is gone, but Republicans might now lose the Senate because of what this president is doing by focusing on his pet projects. He's focused on reflecting pools, ballrooms, Bibi Netanyahu, the SAVE Act. He doesn't give a damn about the American people, and that's what Democrats are going to run on all fall.
Finally, Andrew Donaldson, you know, Iran is expecting a $40 billion windfall from opening the Strait of Hormuz. I'll never forget the language that President Trump used about Obama and what he had on the table with Iran. I mean, it was like 150 billion. Trump's now has 300 billion on the table, which has sickened a lot of Republicans. It also has sickened Israel. Finally, your comments.
Yeah, we talked about the Obama era agreement. It was an imperfect document. It was not a great document. It wasn't a great thing, but I'm a country kid. Even a bad fence that's kind of in disrepair, you might want to find out why it's there before you go ripping it down and tearing it out. We took that down and they ripped it up, which was fine, but they didn't have a plan to replace it. And then, of course, a couple of years later, here we be, and we're going to wind up in a worse place. This is very telling because the entire idea of going to war is the status quo is so intolerable that we need to put blood and treasure on the line to change the status quo. And now, after 400 casualties, 13 dead, that's just on our side. Who knows how many thousands of Iranians, and billions of dollars, both real money and in projected economic cost in Iran now. And we're at a status quo that's probably worse than we started. That's the framework we have to look at this thing and then start trying to see how we salvage it from there, because that's the truth.
Robert Patillo, Andrew Donaldson, thank you for joining us. When we return, we'll turn our attentions to crime, safety, and does anyone have any answers? I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. John Malcolm is Vice President for the Institute for Constitutional Government, and of course, our very own Leonard Sipes Jr., crime media relations, expert author, success with the media. We welcome them both. Let me start with you, Leonard. This vampire case that the Supreme Court just ruled on, I just touched on it a little with our earlier guest, is a big deal for the Second Amendment.
Absolutely. Probably 80% of the court decisions that I'm seeing outside of this, including the Supreme Court and lower courts, seem to be in favor of gun rights. And I think that's something that's happening throughout the country. There just seems to be a certain sense of intolerance about restrictions on carrying firearms.
John, across America and much of the world, fear of crime remains high, even where violent crime has declined. Why has public confidence been so difficult to restore?
Well, you have to say, compared to what? So violent crimes have not reached the levels that they did in the, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, but they certainly spiked considerably during the pandemic. And you're right that they are down slightly from that, but they have not returned to pre-pandemic levels and are still very high. And in certain urban areas, particularly those that are governed by so-called progressive prosecutors, areas like Chicago and New York City, although New York City is doing better, crime is still very, very high. And further, fear of crime has always pulled higher than actual crime rates. So that's not exactly surprising. But look, crime is still high. And while there had been fewer reported crimes, reporting is also spotty, and I think the public senses that too.
Leonard, how much of today's fear, I'm listening to John Malcolm, and I'm wondering how much is it actually driven by actual crime trends, and how much is amplified by social media, 24-hour news coverage, and viral videos?
Armstrong, it's very complex because the overwhelming majority of crime in the United States is not reported per the National Crime Victimization Survey. I just want to note, as I always do on your program, that according to the U.S. Department of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey, we have a 44% increase in rates of violent crime. And it's been that way for the last 3 years. Although your other guest is correct in terms of reported crime being down a bit. But fear of crime depends upon lots of different things. It depends upon what your neighbors are saying, what your family is saying, what you're seeing in terms of graffiti, what you're seeing in terms of litter, what you're seeing in terms of things that create this a sense of discomfort on the part of the American people. So fear of crime is far more complex than crime statistics itself. But, it's just interesting of how fear of crime is now up in Europe. Fear of crime is going through the roof in terms of Central and South America. The whole issue of fear of crime is just not a United States issue. In the United States, according to Gallup, the most serious measure of fear of crime, worrying a great deal, is down from 53% to 39%. It was at record levels in 2023. But across the board, if you include moderate fear of crime or fear of crime across the board, the vast majority of Americans express a fear of crime. The vast majority of people in Europe are expressing a fear of crime, and the sense of fear of crime within Central and South America is through the roof.
So, John, what are the most effective strategies for reducing violent crime while protecting constitutional rights and maintaining the community trust?
Well, look, I think aggressive policing and prosecutors who are, willing to enforce the law in terms of things like three strikes laws, not downgrading serious felonies to, misdemeanors, and taking crime seriously. So you made a very good point about social media. I mean, it's always been the case that, quote unquote, if it bleeds, it leads. And Leonard, also pointed out that this is not unique to the United States. I mean, crime in Central and South America has been out of control for quite some time, largely led by terrorist gangs and also drug cartels. Some leaders for example, President Bukele in El Salvador have taken rather draconian measures to address crime, basically allowing him to lock up anybody who's suspected of being a cartel member or a gang member and holding them for significant period of time without charge or trial. Those measures have actually proven to be quite popular. So other countries in that hemisphere are thinking of following Bukele's lead. In Europe, it's a little bit different. You have large pockets of immigrant communities where it's suspected that crime is not being reported, and it's actually fairly widespread. Police have decided that there are certain no-go zones where unless somebody is literally murdered, they won't go into those areas. And in the UK in particular, they've been rocked by a couple of scandals recently. So there was a Sikh man last year who fatally stabbed an 18-year-old white guy. But when the police came upon this bleeding victim, the perpetrator of this crime said, oh, well, he gave me a racist tone. He said something really racist about me. So they put handcuffs on the guy who was bleeding to death in front of them and allowed this Sikh gentleman to leave. They later determined that was false. The guy died. They arrested him, convicted him. He's now behind bars. But that certainly shook confidence in the police. And very recently, there was a report that came out about massive human trafficking that's been taking place over a series of decades in pockets of the UK, where the police were turning a blind eye to it, and literally tens of thousands, perhaps over a couple of 100,000 women and children were being trafficked, and no one was really taking that very seriously. And so that has shaken a lot of confidence in law enforcement for justifiable reasons.
And it should. Leonard, have policymakers focused too heavily on reacting to crime instead of addressing its underlying causes, including the family instability, the education, addiction, and mental health? I look at, you can't help it when you're on social media. Something just pops up, and it's always someone cursing, yelling profane language at police officers, disrespecting police officers, as if this is something we're celebrating now. It's just crazy how law enforcement is so dishonored.
It is amazing, and within the law enforcement community, it's a topic that comes up time after time after time in terms of police stress and in terms of PTSD amongst police officers. Root causes of crime. First of all, I need to know what the root causes of crime are. In my own personal opinion, it's child abuse and neglect. I do believe that the vast majority of people that I spoke to, and I've interviewed hundreds of people caught up in the criminal justice system, mostly in prisons, describing their background as horrific. The rate of sexual abuse for female offenders is off the chain. So you have all sorts of problems that stem from lack of parenting and abuse within the family, abuse within the community, the level of brain injuries amongst people coming in, younger people coming into the juvenile justice system and the adult criminal justice system. Brain damage is, again, just extraordinary. So we have a real problem in this country in terms of how we treat our younger individuals. If you would actually take a really serious look in terms of child abuse and neglect within this country, and get parents to be parents, and to get parents to provide love and tenderness and care and protection towards their children, and demands in terms of proper behavior, in terms of school and elsewhere, the rate of crime in this country would plummet. We don't have a school to prison pipeline. We have a family and community prison to prison pipeline.
So John, how should the justice system differentiate between offenders who genuinely cannot pay restitution and those who simply refuse to pay restitution?
Well, one, you have to do some investigation as to their ability to pay, what property they have, what they have in their bank accounts, and also what it is they're spending their money on. I mean, if people are going out and gambling, or buying excessive amounts of alcohol, or spending money on, I once prosecuted somebody who didn't pay his taxes. Instead, what he was paying were expensive vacations and his country club fees. People have to take their restitution orders seriously. There is a victim out there who needs to be compensated. And you need to make sure that somebody does have the wherewithal. If they don't have the wherewithal, are they making an effort to get a job and acquire the wherewithal, and then make sure that they are prioritizing making the payments to recompense their victims. Let me comment very briefly on what Leonard said. I think he's absolutely correct, obviously, about some of the underlying causes of crime. It's a complex issue, and I certainly believe that you need to take an all of government approach to looking at underlying causes and trying to address those. But in the meantime, until you have addressed those underlying causes, the public still deserves to be safe. So even if somebody has had a horrific upbringing and has turned to crime, while that is certainly understandable, at some point that person still needs to be incarcerated so that they don't commit more crime and cause more victims.
So Leonard, has the criminal justice system shifted way too far toward offender rehabilitation at the expense of victims? Because listen, of their rights, because is this just the current balance that's appropriate?
Well, first of all, let's take a look back again at Europe. I mean, Europe has a fairly liberal view, a progressive view of crime and justice, and country after country after country in Europe is turning to incarceration and turning to stricter enforcement. I mean, Denmark, for the love of heavens, they're building prisons in Denmark. Denmark's the most liberal city from a criminal justice, liberal country and city, from a progressive point of view. They are, because of their juvenile justice problem and other problems, they are now building prisons. Other European nations are building prisons. So you have El Salvador, that has the highest rate of incarceration in the country, and the president of El Salvador is extremely popular. Now you have the whole mess of countries in Central and South America that are beginning to emulate his sense of building huge prisons and more aggressive law enforcement. You have Costa Rica, again, probably the most liberal country in Central America. They want to emulate El Salvador's experience. So we have something pretty daggone interesting going on throughout the country, throughout the world, in terms of a greater reliance on more aggressive law enforcement, a greater reliance on incarceration. Whether that's good or whether that's bad remains to be seen, but it's happening in Europe, Central America, and South America. It's not the case in the United States. Have we gone too far to the left in terms of the United States? Well, we have to be sure that our law enforcement is constitutional. We have to be sure that our law enforcement is fair. We have to be sure that our law enforcement is just. But there still is a residual concern over the Freddie Gray and the other incidents that happened where there was an immense amount of criticism of law enforcement, and they backed off. And because they backed off of progressive policing, and if you take a look at studies done by Harvard, for with over 1,000 programs, progressive policing was the only quote-unquote crime prevention modality that actually had a track record of working. So if you back off of progressive policing like law enforcement has over the last 4 or 5, 6 years, You expect crime to go up a little bit, and that's been substantiated by a 44% increase in violent crime, rates of violent crime by the National Crime Victimization Survey. However, reported crimes reported to law enforcement have dropped.
And we'll be back. You know, guys, public safety is about more than just policing. What role, John, should parents, educators, faith leaders, business and community organizations, and the media play in creating safer communities?
Well, I'm not sure you're ever going to get the media to play a role in
Let's talk about it. We need to talk about it, though.
You know, well, because as I said, when it bleeds, it leads, and they care a lot more about clicks. They're not going to talk about the feel-good stories about a really good parenting job that took place. But yeah, look, police are first responders, but they're the ones who are showing up after a situation has already escalated. I mean, you know, Leonard was absolutely correct that it takes years of development. And we need to have a robust civil society. You need to have churches and community leaders and you know, safe civic organizations, and certainly parenting needs to create a healthy environment for children to develop healthy attitudes towards their fellow man, and not to view them as you know, potential victims to be taken advantage of. He's right that there's been a lot of breakdown in the family, and the government has certainly contributed to a breakdown in civil society, and those are all to be decried and ought to be reversed.
But you know, Leonard, how can law enforcement rebuild the breach of trust, and it has been breached, while remaining proactive in preventing violent crime?
It takes, Armstrong, it takes an extraordinary amount of work between law enforcement and the community. I've said something that some folks within the law enforcement community don't like, and that is that average citizens and communities have a right to insist upon what it is that they want out of law enforcement. I mean, we do have elected sheriffs throughout the country who run on platforms every year, and citizens get to express the kind of law enforcement that they're looking for through an elective process. But for most cities that are appointed, there just has to be an immense amount of communication between law enforcement and communities to get their point of view and to respect their particular point of view. But I should say that according to Gallup and other polls, there's a lot of support for law enforcement throughout the United States. There's a lot of support regardless of demographics. So the vast majority of people have a sense of respect for law enforcement, support law enforcement, want law enforcement in their communities, but they just want to be respected. The individual citizens simply want to be respected, and that's probably the key ingredient to be sure that we in law enforcement are respecting citizens, are respecting communities, and are respecting their particular points of view. But without community and individual and parental support for law enforcement, everything, John, I agree with John, it sort of falls apart. We need the community. We need the parents. If you go to, when I left law enforcement and went to college and studied criminology, the first lesson was that without the community support, the criminal justice system doesn't work. And that communities and families and individuals control crime far more than law enforcement.
You know, John, we're soon celebrating our 250th anniversary founding. How can we preserve both liberty and security without sacrificing one for the other?
Well, that's a tough thing to do, particularly in an age of artificial intelligence and increased surveillance. I don't think that has to do so much with policing. although those are investigative techniques that are used by police officers. And I think we're going to have a robust discussion in our society about, do you want cameras on every street corner? Do you want law enforcement to be able to track your personal, cell phone devices in terms of where it is that you go? Do you want your car to record information, whether you know it or not, about where you're going and what happens to you and how fast you're going? There are advantages to all of these things, but there are significant disadvantages to all of these things. So that, in terms of privacy and liberty interests versus feeling safe, those are going to be very important discussions that we are just beginning to have. In terms of policing, what Leonard said was right, which is when you have some community leaders who are decrying racism among police officers, when they do polls of people who are in communities where there's a lot of crime taking place, they say, we don't want fewer police officers, we want more police officers. But every time there is a Freddie Gray incident or a George Floyd incident, it does intense damage to the reputation of police officers, and it takes a lot to win back the support of the community so that they will actually reach out to you and talk about the bad actors who are in that community causing problems, or will report crime, or will be witnesses when someone's apprehended and they've seen what happened when the crime was committed. When there's distrust for the police officers, it hurts retention, it hurts recruiting, and it certainly makes it a lot more difficult for police officers to solve crimes.
So, Leonard, when you look across the country, policymakers continue debating this criminal justice reform. In your view, what reforms have worked and which have produced unintended consequences?
The overwhelming majority of what we call reforms have not worked, per literature reviews, per research. I mean, look, somebody once asked, are you against rehabilitation programs for people caught up in the criminal justice system? No. Teaching a person how to read, teaching a person how to write, teaching a person a skill while in prison or even on parole and probation, I'm 100% for it from a humanitarian point of view. However, according to the data, and it's really good data funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, these programs do not work to reduce recidivism. So, the point is that, again, we look towards government to solve the crime problem, to solve the fear of crime problem, where we have to look at ourselves. We have to look internally at our communities. We have to look at ourselves as individuals. We have to be good, decent people. We have to follow the teachings of Jesus and every other religious leader in the world in terms of treating other people in the way that we want to be treated. We need to become a moral society where we embrace the decent treatment of all human beings, regardless of who they are. So I think that's the heart and soul of solving the crime problem. I don't think government has the capacity to, quote unquote, solve the crime problem unless we're willing to take some, what I consider to be draconian actions, and that's what we're struggling with now in terms of artificial intelligence within law enforcement. I looked at an article recently about artificial intelligence in Europe, and it really hasn't worked all that well in terms of law enforcement. Doing risk analysis of people in the United States hasn't worked all that well either. If we want a crime-free, friendly, just, moral society, we need to look at ourselves. We need to look at our own communities. We need to demand that we behave.
John, we have about 45 seconds, and I want you to answer how policymakers balance rehabilitation, accountability, and public safety when designing these criminal justice policies.
Well, that's a very important point, and I would push back a little bit on what Leonard said. He's right that the data so far doesn't support that a lot of these programs are having a significant reduction in recidivism. Some programs, like Prison Fellowship, I think are doing a really good job. And with respect to some of the other programs, the only thing I would say is these are early days. These programs need to be robust and they need to be tested, and those really just beginning. So I believe everything about aggressive policing. I believe that you need to keep public safe and keeping people incarcerated for the right length of time. But I wouldn't quite give up yet on rehabilitation programs, because we can't prosecute our way out of the crime problem that we have.
John, Leonard, Andrew Donaldson, Robert Patillo. I cannot thank all of you today for such a robust conversation on this July 27th day, Saturday. Enjoy the State Fair if you're in Washington, D.C. We're celebrating our 250th anniversary from June 24th to July 11th. You want to come on the mall July 10th and enjoy the fair. The Ferris wheel, it is fantastic. I feel like I'm back in the country enjoying the fair with all the things that I enjoyed when I was a boy. Thank you for joining us.